Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Fracking with Forever Chemicals in Colorado. I'm Barbara Gottlieb. I'm the Program Director for Physicians for Social Responsibility's National Environment and Health Program. Glad you could join us. Well, for those of you who don't know us, PSR is a national nonprofit founded and led by physicians and encompassing health professionals of all types, as well as concerned lay people. We address two of the greatest threats to human health and survival, climate change and nuclear war, and we educate and engage health professionals to take action. Our staff and our members speak, write, and publish reports and other resource materials on these issues. We educate the public and policymakers, and we engage in policy advocacy. We have a vibrant chapter here in Colorado, as well as 23 other chapters around the country. Our webinar today presents and builds on the findings of PSR's latest report, Fracking with Forever Chemicals in Colorado. In this report, which we released just 2 days ago, we analyzed data that was reported by the oil and gas industry about the chemicals they use in drilling and fracking. That analysis leads us to two takeaways that are very important for Coloradans. First, we found that PFAS chemicals, which are both toxic and incredibly potent, have been used in oil and gas extraction in Colorado. Secondly, though, we found that Colorado law allows chemical manufacturers, oil and gas companies or well operators to hide the identity of many of the chemicals they use behind claims of confidential business information or trade secrets. Our two speakers today will provide more details on these points, and they will also highlight the implications of these findings for your health and well-being. Our first speaker is report researcher and lead author, Dusty Horwitt. Dusty is a consultant to Physicians for Social Responsibility. He's also an attorney and a former reporter. Dusty has spent more than 15 years working with nonprofit organizations to protect communities from the environmental impacts of oil and gas drilling and fracking. And he's been quoted and his work has been featured in media outlets, including the New York Times, Philadelphia Inquirer, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Wall Street Journal, and Marketplace on NPR. Last July 2021, Dusty authored PSR's report that publicized for the first time the use of PFAS or forever chemicals in oil and gas extraction. We're very pleased to be joined today by Sonia Lunn. Sonia is the Sierra Club's Senior Toxics Policy Advisor. She leads Sierra Club's work on a range of toxics issues. Sonia holds a master's degree in public health from UC Berkeley, where she studied toxicology and risk assessment. And she has worked on toxic substances policy reform and campaigns to improve state and federal regulation of drinking water, air quality, toxic chemicals, and most recently, focusing on PFAS issues. I'm happy now to pass the microphone to our speakers. Let me just mention that we're reserving plenty of time at the end for question and answer. Please write your questions into the question and answer box, and then we'll read them aloud. By the way, this presentation is being recorded. Our first speaker is Dusty. Dusty, can you take it away?
All right, thanks so much, Barb. I'm going to share my screen here. Bear with me just a moment. All right. If anyone has trouble seeing this, please let me know. Thanks so much for the introduction, Barb. As Barb mentioned, our report looks at the use of PFAS or forever chemicals in Colorado and the gaps in Colorado's disclosure rules that prevent the public from knowing, in many cases, how extensive the use of these chemicals and other toxic chemicals in oil and gas operations are. I want to start by giving a little background on oil and gas drilling and fracking to explain why we're concerned about exposure to chemicals used in these processes. Over the past 20 years or so, the oil and gas industry has moved from drilling in relatively remote locations to drilling increasingly where people live. And the reason for that shift has been because the oil and gas industry has largely depleted so-called conventional deposits of oil and gas that were easier to access and has moved to exploit what are called unconventional deposits, in which the oil and gas is much more widely dispersed underground and locked up in deposits of rock. These deposits increasingly are where people live, and you can see a photograph here of the Belo Romero Elementary School in Greeley, Colorado, in Weld County. And you can see in the background there's a drilling rig. It shows how close some of these drilling operations are to where people live, work, go to school. This is happening not just in Colorado, but in other states as well. Chemicals are used in multiple stages of oil and gas drilling. The first stage that we are concerned about is drilling. Here's a diagram showing what an oil and gas well looks like from the surface. This is a horizontal well, and much of the drilling that's going on in Weld County, Colorado, is horizontal drilling. And in this process, the companies drill down vertically, as you can see in this diagram, and then deep underground, they steer the drill bit and drill out horizontally. And they often do this in shale formations. The reason being that shale formations run in relatively narrow bands underground, and the companies want to bore all the way through that narrow band of shale so they can access more of the surface area. You can see at the surface here on this diagram, there's a blue swath, and that is the groundwater. So companies are going to drill right through that groundwater. And here is another diagram from EPA that shows from a different angle what the drilling process looks like. So at the very top of the diagram, where the little horizontal green line is the surface of the earth. The little vertical line next to that is called, it represents conductor pipe that oil and gas companies insert into the ground. That stabilizes the ground and enables them to drill deeper. And if you look, basically the well proceeds in from the outside. So the oil and gas companies are going to put that conductor pipe in, then they're going to drill down below the groundwater, and that's represented by this blue bar that the well goes through. At this point in the process, the oil and gas companies have not inserted any steel casing or cement, which they will do later, to seal off the groundwater from any chemicals they might be using. And we know that they use chemicals in the drilling process, and that some of these chemicals are toxic. One company, for example, has reported using xylene in drilling, which is a neurotoxic chemical. So if they're using these chemicals in the drilling process and they bore right through the groundwater, which is typical, those chemicals are likely to go into the groundwater and pose risks for people and also for agriculture. So after they drill through that first stage, they insert this, what's represented by a longer black line here, that steel casing. And then they inject into that steel casing cement that hits the bottom of the well and then fills up back around the outside of the casing. And that, in theory, forms an impermeable barrier between the casing and the rock, sealing off the groundwater from the well. They repeat this process various times, drilling deeper, installing more casing and cement until they reach the target formation where they want to produce oil and gas. Unfortunately, sometimes in this process, things go wrong. This is another diagram from EPA showing how there can be leaks in the casing and cement in the drilling process. For example, this first bubble at the top right of the slide shows that sometimes there can be a break or a crack in the steel casing, and that can allow fluid to get out into the formation and perhaps into the groundwater. Each of these bubbles represents something different that could go wrong in the drilling of the wells, from leaks in the casing to cracks in the cement to gaps between the cement and the casing that allow fluids to migrate upward into groundwater. So this poses some serious risks especially when we know that at least some of the chemicals used in this process are toxic. When drilling is complete and that well is cemented into place, the drilling companies will typically hydraulically fracture or frack the well. Fracking typically involves injecting underground into the wells at high pressure a mix of water, sand, and chemicals. The amounts of water used in modern wells can be staggering, up to 10 million gallons of water or more. This is a photograph of a fracking operation in Pennsylvania. I will note that good photographs of fracking operations in progress are difficult to find. I was trying to find one from Colorado, and we'll find one in the near future. But this is a good representation of what a fracking operation looks like. You can see how much equipment is required to do this. There are trucks that are backed up to the well that provide the pressure to force the fluid into the well at extremely high pressures. It can be sometimes 10,000 pounds per square inch, which compares to about 100 pounds per square inch for the water coming out of a fire hose. So it's a lot of pressure. And they need to burn a lot of diesel fuel to run these pumper trucks, which as they're called. They're tanks in the back left of this picture, and those hold chemicals that are injected. The amount of the chemicals in the fracking fluid is typically very small. 1% or less of the fluid can be composed of the chemicals. But as we will hear, some of these chemicals can be so toxic that even very small amounts of these chemicals can contaminate large amounts of drinking water and could make people sick if people were exposed. After fracking, and the goal of fracking is to create fractures in those underground formations that free up the oil and gas that is locked in the rock. Then the companies turn off that pressure in the well, and that causes the water that was injected in fracking and the chemicals to flow back up to the surface where it is collected as wastewater. That wastewater can include the chemicals that were injected in fracking, as well as naturally occurring contaminants in the underground formations, probably the most serious of which is naturally occurring radium, which is radioactive and carcinogenic. The preferred means of disposing of this wastewater is to re-inject it into underground injection wells. And this is a photo of the wellhead of one of these wells. That process also creates risks. And what EPA has found is that throughout the fracking process, there are risks of contamination. EPA found that there are more than 1,600 chemicals found to have been used in fracking fluid or in the wastewater that comes out of these wells. There is not great health information about a lot of these chemicals, but for the ones for which health information is known, the facts are troubling. The health effects associated with these chemicals include carcinogenicity, or the ability to cause cancer, neurotoxicity, kidney, liver toxicity, and reproductive and developmental toxicity. So the chemicals that go into the wells can be very risky. The chemicals that come out of the wells can also be risky. And there are multiple pathways through which people could be exposed, including spills on the surface of the chemicals that are being used to conduct the fracking. When the wastewater is collected and taken to these wastewater injection wells, where it's injected underground for supposedly permanent storage, that wastewater can spill, threatening groundwater or surface water supplies. There have been documented cases of these wastewater wells leaking and causing underground contamination. And then there's also the potential for the underground injections of fracking to intersect with naturally occurring fractures or nearby oil and gas wells, and that create pathways for the fluid to migrate up near the surface where groundwater is found and could be contaminated. The potential that people could be exposed and become sick is real. Studies have found that people living near oil and gas wells do suffer disproportionate health impacts compared to people living farther away from those wells. Those studies, including studies done in Colorado, have found health impacts, including cancer, congenital heart defects, and low birth weight babies occurring disproportionately in populations that live near oil and gas operations. And so, in light of these multiple risks of exposure to chemicals throughout the oil and gas extraction process, from drilling through fracking and wastewater disposal, we wanted to take a look at a class of chemicals that people across the country are increasingly concerned about, and look at the use of these chemicals in oil and gas operations in Colorado. And those chemicals are called PFAS, or forever chemicals. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Sonia to tell us a little bit about PFAS and why we should be concerned about their use in oil and gas operations in Colorado.
Thank you, Dusty. And you can go to the next slide. Hi, everyone. My name is Sonia Lunn. Good afternoon. I am the Senior Toxics Policy Advisor for the Sierra Club nationally. I live and work in Colorado. And this presentation and this report really from PSR is the marriage of kind of two different themes of advocacy: concern about chemicals in the environment, as well as our concern about a specific class of chemicals known as PFAS, which to me really exemplify all the challenges with our nation's toxic rules that govern toxic chemicals. So if you go to the next slide. My PFAS chemicals are otherwise known as Teflon chemicals. They are a long-term, long-running industrial workhorse in the United States and worldwide. With the discovery of the strength of the bond between a carbon atom and fluorine atoms, the idea that making these long chain fluorochemicals actually are, they're an incredibly powerful, unique type of chemistry that can impart a non-stick quality to fabrics or to cookware. It can impart a breathable yet waterproof quality when it's used on a jacket, or a grease-proof layer on bakery paper, so that when you buy a donut, you don't realize exactly how much grease is coming off onto something like a paper napkin. And they're also really fire resistant. These chemicals have the bond between a carbon and fluorine has the qualities of takes a bolt of lightning to break it apart. And so you can smother a fire with a layer of fluorochemicals and actually have the fire be extinguished. So these are just a really novel type property of PFAS. And the next slide is that, unfortunately, that incredible persistence means that the chemicals in many cases persist in the human body, and they look like a protein, and they're associated with a huge variety of intense impacts to the human body, which have only become clear over decades, and really after some intense industrial poisonings were discovered, and intense contamination of the food supply. They're linked to several forms of cancer, thyroid problems, problems in the digestive system, ulcerative colitis. Exposure to PFAS during gestation and early life can lead to long-term suppression of the immune system, and they measure this by kids having less effective protection after their routine childhood vaccines. And that's because the immune system just doesn't mount as powerful antibody response when it has PFAS chemicals kind of messing it up. Lots of different types of organ damage: kidney, thyroid, liver damage, and then a variety of harms during pregnancy and childhood. So as we've been able to develop the ability to measure incredibly low concentrations of PFAS in the environment, there's also been a huge burden of studies that have been put forward that link PFAS exposure to a variety of effects. Next slide. I don't know if you've turned the camera on me either. I don't mind if you do. PFAS have been widely detected in drinking water. In fact, drinking water for millions of Americans now is known to contain these chemicals. This is a map from the Environmental Working Group and PFAS action team at a university, sorry, I'm blanking on the name, that really shows that states that have done exhaustive water sampling for PFAS chemicals have detected the chemicals, and this is at the parts per trillion concentration. This has really brought a lot of visibility to the sources of PFAS in the environment, and the fact that people living even sometimes quite distant from an industrial source will have contaminated water, and that the cost and complication of removing PFAS from water is creating a huge strain on the drinking water system in the United States. Next slide. And locally in Colorado, we've seen some great work by our state agency to measure PFAS in drinking water. They've offered this service to drinking water agencies in the state and found there are places kind of in funny locations all around the state where there is PFAS measured in the drinking water. And not represented on this slide is, the most notorious example is the communities of Fountain, Security, and Widefield, which are downriver or down gradient from the Peterson Air Force Base, where 70,000 Coloradans drink contaminated water probably for decades and have some of the highest concentrations of PFAS measured in their body of people anywhere in the United States due to that military contamination. Now there's water treatment in place in those three areas, but there's concern about ongoing exposure for people who live outside of those areas where they may be on a well and be drinking contaminated water. Next slide. So while the issue of water contamination has been a real driver of the conversation and concern about PFAS regulation, this is a map gained that is put together by public employees for environmental responsibility. And they created a FOIA request to EPA for all of the information about where EPA has collected about places where PFAS may be used. And surprisingly, an incredible number of those locations were in Colorado, and an incredible number of the locations in Colorado are the pink dots, which were reports at oil and gas sites. So this really galvanized people's attention, because before PSR started doing this investigation and before the peer map was, data was created and mapped, this was really flying under our radar. We have this long list of places where we've seen PFAS contamination, industries that we know discharge PFAS, but this idea that the most potent and toxic chemicals that we're dealing with nationally are used potentially in the oil and gas industry was actually quite a surprise, even for someone like me who's been deep in the regulatory and legal questions related to PFAS for several years now. So the combination of the PSR report that looked at the frac focus data nationally and this new Colorado specific data really cued a lot of questions for people living and working in Colorado. So next slide is, just kind of drawing it back to, while water contamination has been a huge focus, we wanted people to understand that the widespread use of PFAS in the environment has led to contamination of the food supply, and PFAS are commonly measured in fish and meat and lots of other types of foods. They're used on a lot of consumer items, so that your direct contact with a treated rug, vaporizing even from a waterproof raincoat, or other ways that you have contact with consumer products could be a route of inhalation, or you get it on your hands and into your body that way. And then the ongoing use in food packaging means that the PFAS chemicals either rub up against the food that you're going to eat, or in the case of microwave popcorn, which is kind of a classic use of PFAS in the food supply, that puff of air when you smell the microwave popcorn, open, is a PFAS treated product in many cases. In a way, you might be ingesting the chemical as well. Next slide. So despite a lot of concern among scientists, among regulators, we still do not see meaningful regulation of this class of chemicals. And this is bringing it back to the idea that the regulatory system in the US is broken, it's slow moving, it's data intensive, it's cumbersome. We set a very high bar for the agency to take, Environmental Protection Agency, to take any kind of meaningful action to restrict chemical uses. And we're years away from even having something as simple as an enforceable drinking water standard. And so there's a voluntary ban on 2 types of PFAS chemicals. There's a non-binding drinking water advisory level, but there really isn't restriction on the use of PFAS in firefighting foams or in consumer products that we have daily contact with. There are no restrictions or very limited, not systematic restrictions on emissions into air or into water or wastewater. In fact, the toxics release inventory, that is our way of gathering information about the industries using PFAS chemicals, just listed PFAS, has 1 year of reporting data, and is mostly concentrating at this point on the chemicals that have already been taken out of commerce. So there's no reporting requirements systematically for the PFAS chemicals that are, most of the PFAS chemicals that are currently in use. So therefore, regulators like in Colorado or nationally have really have to do detective work to even figure out where the chemicals might be stored, used, and how they're getting into something like Colorado's surface water, where PFAS are measured in every single surface water sample that's collected by our state agency. And as PSR's report from last year that Dusty may talk about highlighted, there's really a continued approval by EPA's new chemical division of PFAS type chemistry. Knowing all the problems we have and all the challenges regulating chemicals that have already been approved and are in widespread use, the agency continues to review and approve new replacement chemicals. And then a long-term problem of storing and destroying the waste. Because of their incredible persistence, PFAS chemicals leak out of landfills. We're concerned that when they're injected into deep wells, they'll find a way to migrate into the usable water. And sometimes they're sent to incinerators where there's little proof that the chemicals can actually be broken down safely. So one more slide. EPA has pledged rapid action on PFAS chemicals. The new administrator, Michael Regan, has said that he will use every tool in the toolbox to regulate PFAS. But it's going to be years before we have some of these basic safeguards in place. And as highlighted, by the fracking advocates across the country, there's a lot of carve outs for the oil and gas industry for basic compliance with clean water, air, and waste rules, which mean that this use and potential use of PFAS in oil and gas wells, I can safely say, does not seem to be on EPA's radar for any kind of oversight or regulation in years to come. So I might leave it with that. I had 2 more slides that kind of focus on state action, but we're halfway through the hour. So if you want to turn back to your presentation, Dusty, that's fine.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sonia, for that background on PFAS. I think that illustrates very well why people are so concerned about this class of chemicals. So we took a look in this report on the use of PFAS in oil and gas operations in Colorado, and I'm going to walk through our major findings. And Sonia, please feel free to jump in with commentary as you see fit. I'm just going to advance the slides here to a map that shows many of our major findings in the report. Before I dive into the map, I want to give a little bit of the background, which is, as Sonia mentioned, PSR first publicized the use of PFAS, or forever chemicals, in oil and gas wells in a report we released in July of last year, 2021. We found that PFAS, or chemicals that could break down into PFAS, had been used in more than 1,200 wells for fracking in 6 different states, though not Colorado. So we decided to take a look at Colorado in light of what we had learned about other states and the experience we had gained in looking for the use of PFAS in oil and gas operations. This is very difficult research. In order to figure out whether these chemicals are being used in oil and gas operations in Colorado, we looked at a database called FracFocus, which is run by 2 non-governmental organizations, the Groundwater Protection Council and the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission. FracFocus serves as a repository for well-by-well hydraulic fracturing chemical disclosure for multiple states around the country. Some states, like Colorado, require oil and gas companies to report the use of their fracking chemicals in each well to FracFocus. In other states, that reporting is voluntary, and companies in some cases do report to FracFocus, though they're not required. So we looked at the FracFocus database with the help of Gary Allison, who is an independent data scientist who has performed a valuable public service by creating an open source version of FracFocus, which is more user-friendly than the one that has existed online for many years. One of the problems with the online version is that there are a lot of typos and misspellings in it. And that can make a difference if you're searching for a particular chemical. If you don't spell it correctly, or if you do spell it correctly, and then it has been entered as being used in a particular well with an incorrect spelling, you're not going to find it. And that puts the public in a very in jeopardy, because if people should be able to know if toxic chemicals are being used near where they live or get their drinking water or go to school. And the fact that there are so many typos and misspellings in FracFocus could hinder the public's ability to gain access to that information. So Gary has helped clean up this data. And so we worked with him to search Colorado's fracking chemical disclosure for the use of PFAS. What we found is that PFAS has been used in almost 300 wells in Colorado, in the form of almost exclusively in the form of PTFE or Teflon. And you can see those represented on this map by the red dots. We also found that companies have used what are called trade secret, at least one trade secret chemical in more than 12,000 wells in Colorado over the past decade. Our search spanned the years 2011 through 2021. Those trade secret wells in which at least one trade secret chemical was used are represented by gold dots. And some of those are covered up by the blue and the red dots in areas like here, north and northwest of Denver in Weld County, which is the most heavily drilled area in Colorado. And then the blue dots represent wells that have been fracked with at least one trade secret surfactant, which is a particular type of chemical. Colorado law allows companies to withhold from the public and from regulators any chemical that they deem to be a trade secret. And as you can see from this map, they have made liberal use of that provision. And that means that the public cannot know the extent of the use of PFAS or other toxic chemicals in Colorado, because these chemicals might be withheld from the public and from regulators under trade secret claims. When companies make trade secret claims, they do have to provide a generic name for the chemical. And so in some cases, they listed a surfactant as the chemical being used, although its specific identity was withheld as a trade secret. That's where you see those blue dots on the map. The reason that we wanted to highlight surfactants is because some of the most infamous PFAS are called fluorosurfactants. These are chemicals like PFOA and PFOS. And so if companies are reporting a trade secret surfactant as being used for fracking in Colorado, there's a possibility that that surfactant might be a fluorosurfactant, and that could pose significant risks to people living near those operations. As you can see, many of these wells that we identified are in Weld County, north and northwest of Denver. Another large area is over in the west in Garfield County. And then there are two other significant areas in southern Colorado where a lot of wells have been fractured with either trade secret chemicals, trade secret surfactants, or in some cases with Teflon. Our maps allow users, that was a static map, which you can see in our report. We also allow users of PSR's website and readers of the report to zoom in on an interactive map. So you can see where wells near where you live, work, or go to school might have been hydraulically fractured with trade secret chemicals or PTFE. This is a well here in Weld County, and this slide illustrates how when you click on the dots, whether the blue, the gold, or the red, you'll see this window come up with more information showing the well's specific identifier or API number at the top, and then other important information like who was the well operator, and then one line says, has trade secret surfactant? And here the answer is yes, it was injected with the trade secret surfactant and also with a trade secret chemical. And then the last line says it was not injected with PTFE. So you can do that on any well on the interactive map, and we hope that feature will be helpful in providing Coloradans more information about what chemicals are being injected into oil and gas wells and how much more information the public should have access to. I want to add too that we did find some evidence that fluorosurfactants were being used in Colorado. There was a scientific paper or an oil and gas industry paper that said that fluorosurfactants had been used in a well in Moffat County, Colorado. However, we were not able to find in the FracFocus database any evidence of fluorosurfactants being used. All we found was evidence of surfactants, unknown trade secret surfactants. And we found that a little bit improbable, considering that in our July report, most of the PFAS or PFAS precursors we found in more than 1,200 wells in 6 different states were fluorosurfactants. And scientific papers have found that fluorosurfactants have been used in the oil and gas industry for 4 or 5 decades. So odds are that they are being used more widely in Colorado than we found. There are some tables in the report I'll briefly call attention to. This is a table that shows county by county in Colorado how many wells were injected with trade secret chemicals, and then the total mass of those trade secret chemicals. That's in these columns on the left-hand side. So if you look and see Adams County on the top left, it says number of wells with at least one trade secret chemical, 231. The mass of all the trade secret chemicals injected into those wells was a mind-boggling almost 13 million pounds. And that's not even the highest, as we'll see, for a county in Colorado. Then we show how many wells were injected with at least one trade secret surfactant. That was 42 wells in Adams County. The mass of those trade secret surfactants, how many wells were injected with PTFE in Adams County, and then the mass of the PTFE injections. So you can find that for each county in Colorado. And I'll just show here the second slide. It shows the rest of the counties, and you can see Weld County, the most heavily drilled county for oil and gas in Colorado, had a staggering 368 million pounds of trade secret chemicals injected in fracking over the last decade, and then more than 10 million pounds of trade secret surfactants and 7,800 pounds of PTFE. I mean, these are huge amounts of chemicals, and the public basically doesn't know what chemicals those are. And that highlights the need for much, much better disclosure in Colorado. One last table I want to show is we highlight 5 individual wells from our report so that readers can see what these figures look like for an individual well. For example, this first one, which was operated by Bayswater Exploration and Production in Weld County. It was fractured in the year 2021. The chemical used in the well was a surfactant. Its CAS number was proprietary. That represents a trade secret claim covering the chemical's CAS number, which is a unique identifier assigned to each chemical by the American Chemical Society That is the best way to identify chemicals. Once you have a CAS number, you can then take that to the scientific literature or take it to scientists, regulators, and find out exactly what the chemical's identity is, find out what its health effects might be, how it behaves in the environment. It's a critical piece of information, and that's often what is withheld from the public when companies claim their chemical identities as trade secrets. The last thing I want to point out on the table is down in the last line with a well operated by TEP Rocky Mountain LLC. If you go over to the very far right-hand column in the last row, you'll see that this well was injected with the smallest mass of all of the chemicals on this table, only 107 pounds compared to thousands of pounds for the other wells. And it was 107 pounds of a non-ionic surfactant. Its identity was proprietary. PFAS can be so toxic that even a mass of 107 pounds could be a big problem. We reported in our recent report that according to recently issued standards, one measuring cup of the PFAS called PFOA would be enough to contaminate almost 8 billion gallons of water to an unsafe level, which is about the amount of water that New York City uses over 6 days. So these are extremely toxic chemicals, and it doesn't take much to create a big problem. Sonia, do you want to add anything about PFAS in use in Colorado?
I think that, just to kind of drive home these points, it is surprising to Dusty and to me, people with long-term experience in campaigns working on both fracking and toxic chemicals, to think about this example, the marriage of the most toxic, least regulated chemical with the industry that has such a big and unanswered questions about potential water contamination, potential air contamination. I think it's hard for people, myself included, who aren't really versed in the fracking situation to understand how something like this could happen where, in a highly toxic chemical was used without even any kind of understanding by the state regulatory agencies. The freedom that these companies have been granted to use almost anything in fracking mixtures is important and notable. And the idea, when I try to imagine, if these surfactants are PFAS chemicals, how loosely we're watching the entire use and disposal process. We have situations in Colorado where, there's pits where flowback waters have just been left to evaporate and settle. Landfills leach, underground well injection sites are not secure. They can be built improperly and there's no real detection to figure out, was that, underground site leaking. I think a lot of the places we put chemicals as waste, we think they stay there. And because of their persistence and their mobility and their volatility, there are so many qualities of PFAS chemicals that mean that they won't stay in a landfill. They'll leach out through the leachate water or down into the ground below. In an incinerator, they won't be broken down. They'll be put into the atmosphere where they can form greenhouse gases that have 1,000-year half-lives. And in deep wells, there's just no system in place to regulate whether or not they're staying put or to monitor for them. So when state agencies don't have full ingredient information, they're not even sure what to look for. If they were to look and see, are these chemicals creating a problem? It's not totally clear that they even have the most basic information ahead of them to figure out what to test for or where to look. Mm-hmm. So yeah, this is a really important story to be bringing forward, and I'm grateful for PSR for doing the digging and the data cleanup and the analysis that it takes to actually make these kind of issues visible to the public.
Great. I wanted to add, before we turn to some of the reforms that Colorado should be looking at, the maps that I showed that demonstrate the just incredible use of trade secret chemicals in oil and gas operations don't even represent all of the chemicals that are being used in those operations without the public's knowledge. And one of the reasons for that is that in Colorado, the only chemicals that oil and gas companies are required to disclose under any conditions to the public are fracking chemicals. They don't have to disclose drilling chemicals at all. So those won't be represented on the map, even under trade secret protection. And Colorado, like most oil and gas, or perhaps all oil and gas producing states, requires fracking chemical disclosure from companies like well operators that are farther down the supply chain from the chemical manufacturers, who will always know what chemicals are being used in oil and gas operations. And there is evidence that in some cases, at least, the end user oil and gas companies, the well operators, or the service companies like Halliburton, who conduct the hydraulic fracturing, don't know all of the chemicals that they're using, and therefore can't report those chemicals to the public, even if they wanted to. And so with that, Sonia, you want to?
Looks like we need to have some time, save some time
Yeah.
for questions and answers. Barbara, are you going to ask questions?
Yes, indeed. If Dusty and Sonia, you're finished, we do have a number of questions. And just to get things started and moving quickly, I'm going to put out two questions at once. Both of them, I think, can be answered pretty expeditiously. One is, why are these chemicals used in fracking? And the second is, why didn't we know about this sooner?
Do you want me to take that? So it's difficult to know why these chemicals are used because of the records are frequently don't reveal much about why they're used in individual wells. And there are a lot of trade secret protections that, including at the federal level, that could shed light on, or that cover areas and documents that could shed light on chemicals use, but obscure that use from the public. From what I have read in scientific papers published about the use of PFAS in oil and gas, they may be used to reduce friction in fracking because they're slippery, and the companies have to burn a lot of energy to conduct the high pressure fracking, and so reducing friction can help reduce those energy needs. And then in other types of oil and gas extraction, they can be used to slick underground formations to make it easier for oil and perhaps natural gas to flow and be collected. Those are a couple of potential uses of PFAS in oil and gas. And as far as why we're only finding out now that they're being used, that's a great question. I think partly it's because of the extensive secrecy in the oil and gas industry for years. It's probably also because of pressure on regulators. There's a history at EPA of regulators talking about pressure from the oil and gas industry not to regulate as well as they should. Those are two possibilities. Sonia, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think you got it covered. There's a lot of secrecy outside of the chemical industry on, toxic chemical uses and PFAS uses across the board.
Thank you. Two more questions. The first is anybody testing for PFAS around oil and gas wells here? I'm sure meaning in Colorado. And the second one, if PFAS are so dangerous, how come we haven't seen any health effects from them? Again, I think that probably means from their use in oil and gas wells. I'd like to take one of those.
You want me to? I can take the first one.
Yeah, I'll take the second.
Okay. So we asked the state of Colorado if they had conducted any testing for PFAS around oil and gas wells, and we're told no, that they have not. There may have been some testing in a case where firefighting foam was used to extinguish an oil and gas fire, and the foam contained PFAS, but the official answer we heard from the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission was they have not conducted testing for the use of PFAS in oil and gas wells at oil and gas sites.
And yeah, I think the reason that there hasn't been more testing is because it literally wasn't on people's radar that these highly toxic chemicals would be used for this purpose before. And I think that one hope would be that there's better disclosure of the ingredients used in the oil and gas industry, and then there's a little bit more curiosity and follow-up about what the potential impacts of those chemicals could or would be.
Thank you. Let me move on to another question. This question says, can information from other states that do have PFAS reporting be used to estimate or model how many of the wells that have trade secret chemicals not reported are likely to have used PFAS? I guess the first question embedded in that is, are there other states that are specifically reporting their use of PFAS?
Sonia, do you want to take that?
Well, what I know I learned from PSR, so why don't you start on that one?
Other states reporting, is the question referencing the PFAS that we discovered in other states is being used in oil and gas wells?
I think there may be I think what they're referring to is that, Dusty, you had mentioned earlier that some states have required reporting and other states have voluntary reporting.
Oh, yeah.
But it's not, I don't think that anybody is requiring that they report PFAS, are they?
No, there's not a separate requirement for that. It's just a requirement in multiple oil and gas states that companies disclose their fracking chemicals to the public.
Well, maybe I'll just jump in with one brief addition. This report that we've just released is the first in a series that PSR is going to be producing, looking at the use of PFAS and trade secret chemicals in a number of other states. I think that may tell us if there's any greater visibility for PFAS in other states. And at that point, we may be able to answer this question. But at this point, I don't think that anybody's got enough information about PFAS use in another state in order to be able to use that to model or extrapolate how many of the wells in Colorado that use trade secret chemicals might actually be using PFAS. So we all wish we knew more, but I think we don't. Let me move to another question. Yeah, someone commented that they would love to have the information that, Sonia, you referred to about state level action. I wonder if you can summarize that. And if there's a lot of information, let me just mention that if you'll share it with PSR, we'll be happy to share it with everybody who has registered for the webinar.
Yeah, I'll start off. States are doing a lot to contain and document and address PFAS contamination. That isn't specifically looking at the oil and gas industry yet, but we hope that that would be something that would follow. States are looking at regulating discharges into the wastewater system, and Colorado is a real leader in the state effort to stop dumping PFAS waste down the tap. States are containing and bringing, storing or taking out of service PFAS-based firefighting foams. And again, Colorado is a big leader in addressing that for our PFAS fund. And states are suing the companies that made these chemicals for designing a product that was too toxic and too persistent to be safely used in consumer products and in industrial uses. And those cases have been bundled and are waiting kind of for adjudication in a court in South Carolina. Dusty can tell you a little bit more about what states are doing to regulate fracking chemicals or fracking disclosure.
Sure. Most states don't do a very good job regulating or requiring disclosure of fracking or oil and gas chemicals, in large part because of the problems that we identified in Colorado. Most states allow trade secret exemptions for fracking chemicals. They don't require disclosure of drilling chemicals and don't require disclosures from chemical manufacturers. Two states that do it better in some respects are, one, California requires full disclosure of all fracking chemicals. No trade secrets are allowed for individual chemicals, although companies can withhold recipes of chemical products as confidential. And then Ohio requires disclosure of drilling chemicals in the first stage of drilling that passes through groundwater. But even there, Ohio also allows trade secret exemptions. But those are a couple of states that in some respects do things better than Colorado and the rest.
Thank you for that answer. It's always good to hear that somebody's making some progress on this issue and also offering a model that perhaps could be taken up by other states. I want to ask two more questions. The first of them is it's a two-part question. It has to do, all of this has to do with trade secrets. So this two-part question is, first of all, do other states with drilling allow companies to claim trade secrets? And then the follow-up is, does the so-called Halliburton exemption approved during the Bush administration explain the lack of regulation of PFAS chemicals in fracking?
So the first question is yes, other states do allow companies to withhold chemicals as trade secrets in fracking. And as I mentioned, Ohio allows them to do it in drilling. The Halliburton exemption probably does not explain why there isn't better disclosure on PFAS chemicals. Was that the question?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So the Halliburton exemption exempts hydraulic fracturing from the Safe Drinking Water Act, which otherwise would set standards to protect underground sources of drinking water in fracking. So if the Safe Drinking Water Act applied to fracking, companies would have to do things under federal law, like do a site survey around their fracking well to make sure there weren't upward pathways like abandoned wells that could allow contaminants to migrate up into drinking water. They would have to perform a pressure test on their well to make sure the well wasn't leaking. And because of the Halliburton exemption, they don't have to do that, which is a big problem with the law. But that does not explain why disclosure on PFAS isn't better. Disclosure has been handled primarily at the state level. I do want to add, though, that U.S. Representative Diana DeGette has introduced legislation for many years that would both close the exemption under the Safe Drinking Water Act and, in addition, require disclosure of fracking chemicals under federal law, but that legislation has not advanced.
One more state model to lift up quickly is New York State that would require that the disposal of fracking produced waters and solid waste be considered hazardous waste. And that would just subject it to a lot, not necessarily a perfect system, but would be a lot more realistic considering the complex mix of chemicals, the naturally occurring radioactivity in the subsurface, and then these, unknown effects of complex mixtures. So that at least would tighten up a little a specific aspect of the disposal issue with concern to PFAS and other fracking chemicals.
Right. Thank you both for that. I'd like to finish up with this question. This one comes from a viewer who identifies herself as both a physician and holding a Master's of Public Health degree. And she says, great information. Shocking how this is unregulated. I live adjacent to Garfield County. What can I do as an individual physician in addition to supporting Colorado PSR? And I think this question of what people can do is a wonderful note to end on. Who'd like to start this conversation for us?
I can start. I think typically reform starts at the local level. I would, in my environmental career, I have seen several successful efforts to protect people from oil and gas impacts that have focused on local organizing and education. For example, Sonia just mentioned New York State. New York State banned fracking, which is probably too far a step for Colorado, but certainly Colorado could better regulate fracking and drilling. And the way that New York State was able to do that is because of local organizing that was effective to such an extent that by the time the state banned fracking, there were something like 175 separate cities and towns that had their own bans on fracking. So if you can reach out to physicians in your area, that would be a good starting point to organize them in Garfield County, and then try to expand from there, share information with other organizations, PTA groups, other people who you think might be interested, and then see if you could encourage your local representatives to take a position on that, and then build power up from the ground and try to influence what happens with state policy.
Yeah, and I just say, someone with a public health background, I think, physicians play such a trusted role in community. And people are learning through the COVID epidemic about how much we don't know about our bodies and about medicine. I think it can be very disheartening, but I think that physicians play such an important role in raising questions about the safety of practices, of bringing people's awareness to threats that are otherwise invisible, whether they be viruses or whether they be contaminants in drinking water. I think people think that they'll see and smell and taste pollution when it's near them. And it's really essential. In Colorado, we do have that situation with people being directly impacted and smelling and tasting and seeing flaring, but also for people to understand that the impacts of the oil and gas industry may be invisible or may be hard to trace to their direct health. So I really welcome the conversation among the health community about how invisible and visible environmental threats really pose a risk to our communities.
Well, I'd like to thank both of our speakers, Sonia Lunn and Dusty Horwitt. We are out of time, so we'll have to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining this webinar. We will be sharing the link to everybody who registered. Thank you so much for joining Physicians for Social Responsibility today. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks.